Hey, I said I was going to do one poem about Icarus. I lied. I'm going to do two, just to show you that these stories, really become important cultural reference points for art and for artists. The first poem I'm going to do was written by an Englishman named W.H. Auden, who, well, Englishman slash American. He sort of had dual citizenship, but whatever. And it was written after he visited a museum in Holland. And so the poem is actually named after the Museum of Art in Holland. But in the Museum of Art in Holland is this picture. And this picture is by a guy named Bruegel, and it's called The Fall of Icarus. It's a really interesting poem because you're looking through here and you're like, well, where the heck is Icarus? There's a guy flying here, but he's got a beard, so clearly it's not a kid. That's Daedalus. And he's looking around. Then there's this guy looking up and like, hey, look, there's a dude flying, and there's this guy plowing his field, and there's these ships leaving. Right there, down there in the little bottom corner are these legs and a little splash. That's Icarus falling into the water. And this is the painting that this guy Bruegel did. You'd think that the Icarus would, I mean, the painting's called Icarus. You'd think that Icarus's fall would be front and center, but it's just this little, like in the bottom corner, which is kind of fun. So Auden wrote a poem about this, and this is his poem. I'm just going to read it to you. It's called Musée des Beaux-Arts. It's named after the museum. Sorry, this one doesn't rhyme. Neither does the next one. They're not romantic poems. They're not rhyming poems. About suffering, they were never wrong. The old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of a wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course, anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot, where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone, as it had on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. So, he looks at this painting and it makes him consider some aspects about life. And he considers how all the old masters, when they painted these famous subjects, they would have this famous thing to paint. But then they'd have to fill up all the corners of their painting. And so there'd be things that don't particularly associate with the topic of the painting showing up there. A horse, or this plowman who's like, well, I got fields to plow. Who cares if a kid fell out of the sky? Or this boat who's like, hey, we got places to go, right? And he uses this and thinks about life. And, this is a tragedy for Icarus. It's a tragedy for Daedalus. But to everybody else, it's just a weird thing that happened. And that's kind of how the tragedies of our lives are. It seems unfair, but when you lose somebody, when something difficult happens in your life, it's the center of what's going on with you, but kids are still playing outside. People are still going to the grocery store, cars are still going to work. And then that's, I think, one of the hard things to get over. People are living their lives, even though your life feels like it's shattered or stopped. And that's what Auden sees in this Bruegel painting, and that's the lesson he's pulling from Icarus. It's not a lesson the poet of or the writer of Icarus intended to teach us, but or even maybe that the guy who painted the painting intended to teach us, but it's definitely a lesson that's connected with Icarus, that this is his tragedy, but for the rest of us, meh, life goes on, right? And that's a lesson that we can all take. Here's another Icarus poem by Edward Field. Edward Field was born in 1924. The poem was written in 1950. There's a lot you can think about and ponder about this poem. I'm not going to spend near enough time to analyze it, but this poem's a little different. Actually, I'm just going to read it to you, and then we'll go back and we'll look at it. Icarus by Edward Field. Only the feathers floating around the hat showed that anything more spectacular had occurred than the usual drowning. The police preferred to ignore the confusing aspects of the case, and the witnesses ran off to a gang war. So the report, filed and forgotten in the archives, read simply, drowned. But it was wrong. Icarus had swum away, coming at last to the city where he rented a house and tended the garden. That nice Mr. Hicks, the neighbors called him, never dreaming that the gray, respectable suit concealed arms that had controlled huge wings, nor that those sad, defeated eyes had once compelled the sun. And had he told them, they would have answered with a shocked, uncomprehending stare. No, he could not disturb their neat front yards. Yet all his books insisted that this was a horrible mistake. What was he doing aging in a suburb? Can the genius of the hero fall to the middling stature of the merely talented? And nightly Icarus probes his wound, and daily in his workshop, curtains carefully drawn, constructs small wings and tries to fly to the lighting fixture on the ceiling. Fails every time and hates himself for trying. He had thought himself a hero, had acted heroically, and dreamt of his fall, the tragic fall of a hero, but now he rides commuter trains, serves on various committees, and wishes he had drowned. That's a pretty sad one. I mean, obviously, on some level, it's about suburban life and how living in suburbia has drained from us the epic nature of our previous civilizations. You can't be an epic hero living in suburbia. It's maybe not possible. We all try to conform and be what everybody wants us to be. And those of us that have dreams, we're sort of ashamed of our dreams, and we close the curtains and reset our sights. We're not trying to reach the sun anymore. We're trying to reach the lighting fixture, and we're embarrassed that we're even trying. I think there's some truth to that. The wings in this case don't necessarily represent freedom; they represent dreams, and he hides them beneath a gray, respectable suit. And so if he's a representative of every one of us, then maybe there's something there. But I think that more than that, the poem being written in 1950, I think there's a second and more appropriate reading to it. I think it's written about war veterans who come back, and this is after World War II. I think the Icarus in question is probably a guy who flew fighter planes in World War II. And how, after you've been in a war, any veteran, doesn't matter if you're in the Air Force or the Army or the Navy, and you've seen the things that you've seen, and your decisions are life and death decisions, and you go from this sort of heightened awareness and all of the horrors that are happening around you, and you come back to the United States and you just have to work your basic job. How do you transition back from that kind of a lifestyle to counting beans in the bean factory or whatever it is that you've got to do? I think this poem is a little bit about that too. Let me reread it and go through with that and the other thing that I talked about in mind, because I think both are appropriate ways to interact with this poem. Only the feathers floating around the hat showed that anything more spectacular had occurred than the usual drowning. Now that's direct reference to Icarus and how and to the story as we read it. But maybe he's a pilot whose plane crashed in the ocean. I mean, I think that would work too, and he survived. The police preferred to ignore the confusing aspects of the case. Now, this is a modernization, right, of an old myth. It's weird that we're taking this old myth that's set in ancient Greece and we're recreating it in a modern setting with police. That's interesting. The police preferred to ignore the confusing aspects of the case, and the witness ran off to a gang war. Again, that's a reference to a more modern idea, but I think more appropriately, it's like an interesting tongue-in-cheek reference to the city-states and how they were always at war with each other in ancient Greece. So the report, filed and forgotten. I love that line, filed and forgotten. I mean, think about it. What's the purpose of files? It's so that you can remember something. But the irony is that often we file something, we write it down so that we can forget about it. It's sort of a paradoxical reason for writing something down. But whatever. It read simply drowned, but it was wrong. Icarus had swum away, coming at last to the city where he rented the house and tended the garden. So the poem really takes off at this point. That nice Mr. Hicks, the neighbors called him. I think it's interesting they don't call him Icarus, they call him Hicks. That's probably a reference to people coming to the United States from places like Greece, and their name is Icarus. And when they went through Ellis Island, it got anglicized, it got Americanized. Icarus turned into Hicks, right? Never dreaming that the gray, respectable suit concealed arms that had controlled huge wings. Now, again, if he's a pilot in World War II, this idea that he just looks like everybody else, but we don't see the experiences these people had when we look at them, on the bus or on the train or whatever. We just see them in their gray suit. Nor that those sad, defeated eyes had once compelled the sun. And you get this image of him and his emotional state. He's sad. He feels defeated in his regular life compared maybe to what he used to do. And had he told them, they would have answered with a shocked, uncomprehending stare. Again, maybe this is a commentary on how in the 1950s, all of these World War II veterans, they were told just to live a normal life. It was almost shameful to talk about your experiences or to have any kind of ill effects from the war. That 1950s America sort of image. No, he could not disturb their neat front yards. I think front yards in this case is symbolic. We all have neat front yards. We all put on a front outward appearance to the world, and it all looks nice and it's in a row and everything's in order. But what's going on inside the house, metaphorically speaking, is an interesting question. Yet all his books insisted that this was a horrible mistake. What was he doing aging in a suburb? This is a rhetorical question. Can the genius of the hero fall to the middling stature of the merely talented? How do you go from, that lifestyle, that heroic lifestyle where, whether you're a war hero or whatever, the dreams you have in your youth. Everybody in their youth has dreams, but when they become middle-aged, what are they doing with their life? Not what they thought they would be doing at age 18. So like aging in a suburb is like maybe it's about this 18-year-old kid who was a soldier or whatever, or maybe it's about every 18-year-old kid who has dreams and wants to be things, have big things happen in their lives, but they end up, I don't know, with 2.5 kids and a minivan in a house with a mortgage in the suburbs. I mean, like maybe there's something there too. There's a couple of ways to read this, and I think they're both valid. So I'm running out of time. I wanted this to be about 10 minutes. So we'll roll through the end of this pretty quickly. And nightly Icarus probes his wound, and daily in his workshop, curtains carefully drawn, constructs small wings and tries to fly to the lighting fixture on the ceiling. Again, we already talked about this from sort of the dream perspective. If the wings represent dreams, like every night he's trying to attain these dreams, but he's lowered his expectations. He's not trying to fly to the sun anymore. He's trying to fly to the lighting fixture on the ceiling. He's hiding his dreams so people don't see past the front yard into what goes on inside. But if he's probing his wound, then maybe this is a reference to PTSD, and remembering at night all of the things that he'd seen or all of the things that he'd done. If this is a sort of a war poem, fails every time and hates himself for trying. He had thought himself a hero, had acted heroically, and dreamt of his fall, the tragic fall of a hero, but now rides commuter trains, serves on various committees, and wishes he had drowned. And that's the saddest end of this story. He expected more grandeur, more greatness. He expected to somehow live a life that was heroic. And the problem with being a hero, I think, is that you're only a hero for the few moments that you're being heroic. To try and put that on yourself for the rest of your life seems very, very difficult. Anyway, these are a couple of poems that are about Icarus, and just to sort of broaden your horizons and help you think about what this story means to our culture and the things that different people pull out of it. And I'm sure there's a ton more, but hopefully you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Thanks.